Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Suzanne Goldberg. I'm Executive Vice President for University Life, and I'm so glad to see everybody here tonight for this one of our kickoff events in the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative. Now, I think all of you know a bit about the Office of University Life, but let me just remind you quickly that the Office of University Life focuses on our university as a community. We think about student life issues across all of the schools, we think about our intellectual life as a community, and we think about community citizenship. And coming together tonight is really the bringing together of all of these issues. Let me just ask you, so we can have a sense of who's in the room, how many of you are undergraduates on the campus? And how many of you are graduate students? And anybody from the medical center? Great. And how many of you are faculty or staff? So this is what we do. We really try to bring together all of you as a cross-section. And actually, let me just ask you to do this slightly unconventional thing in a setting like this, which is turn to the person next to you or people next to you and just quickly say your name and which school you're at. And if you all know each other, then find the person behind you. I'll just give you one moment to do that. Part of the reason that I asked you to do that is that we view tonight's event and really all of what we do in the Office of University Life as part of a continuing conversation. And so what I would really ask is that even after tonight's discussion, after we view the segment and hear the panel conversation, if you would just take a moment to talk with the person next to you or in front of you or behind you about this, and then keep the conversation going as you leave. So the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative, which is part of what tonight's event is about. What is it? Well, it asks you a question. It asks you to reflect on the link between sexual respect and your membership in this university community. What is that link? Now, at the core of the initiative, we hope and we ask that you learn some new skills, you gain some new knowledge, you have some new conversations, and that you participate in this in a way that happens not only in this moment, but ongoing throughout the year to really create change in our environment. Because after all, although community sounds like a noun, it is actually a verb, and it is something we create together, and sexual respect, of course, is fundamental to that. In tonight's discussion, by participating tonight, you join more than 50,000 Columbia students for the past several years who have completed the Sexual Respect Initiative. There are many different options you can take in addition to participating tonight. If you haven't already, I guess you probably have since you're here, go to the Sexual Respect website. You can Google Columbia and Sexual Respect, or just go to sexualrespect.columbia.edu and find much more. So tonight we are privileged to be able to be the premier viewers, or among them, for a special segment that is produced through CNN with journalist Lisa Ling, who's here with us, called This Is Sex, which will be a jumping off point after we watch it for a thought-provoking panel conversation that includes a Columbia College junior, a Mailman Public Health faculty, an international trainer in these issues, and MTV star, and all moderated by Lisa Ling. I'll introduce the panelists when we come back. Right now, I actually also want to introduce to you, in case you haven't already met her, Margie Fisher, who is in the back of the room in the white shirt waving. She is Columbia's Title IX coordinator, and she's also always available to answer any questions you might have about issues related to Title IX. You can find her contact information on the Sexual Respect website. So we're about to watch this, and what I'd like to do is turn it over to Lisa Ling just to introduce the segment. Before I do, let me just mention to you that before you sat down, hopefully you picked up the pieces of paper that were on your chair. What are they? They are, I think you had a bookmark, but there was at least one piece of paper that says key facts about the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative. It's essential as part of your participation that you read those facts. right? That's about what is this about, the initiative about, and it has some key facts about sexual respect at Columbia. So that's part of what I'll ask you to do after you're done here tonight, if you haven't done it already. And for now, let me turn it over to Lisa to introduce the segment we're about to watch. Thank you again all for being here.
So thank you all for being here tonight. I know you all have so many things that you could be doing, and we really appreciate you coming to talk about sex. As Suzanne mentioned, This Is Sex is a web series that CNN has produced. It's a 3-part series, and we're going to show you the first installment of it, which is about sex education in high schools throughout the country, and whether or not we should have comprehensive sex education. And the impetus for this whole series was personal. I grew up knowing virtually nothing about sex. I come from a pretty conservative Chinese-American household where my grandmother, who was a very religious woman, said to me at a very early age, "Never let a man see you naked, even your husband." So that's kind of like why I have always felt so much shame and guilt around sex. When I was in 5th grade, there was a mandatory sort of sex education class. They called it sex education. It was really more of an anatomy class, and parents had to sign a consent form to give permission, and there was only one parent who refused to sign that parental waiver, and that was my father. So my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Specht, had to actually come to my home. She said it was the first time she'd ever paid a visit to a student's home, and guilted him into signing the consent form because she said that I would be the only kid in the class who'd have to go sit in the library. And so he reluctantly did it. The class, again, was more of an anatomy lesson, so it wasn't as scintillating as I thought it would be. But nevertheless, that gives you kind of a window into how I grew up. And I would venture to guess that a lot of people grew up experiencing similar levels of guilt and shame around sex. And so that's one of the reasons why we produced this series. And so this first episode, first installment, we shot in a school in Mississippi, which has an abstinence-only mandate in their schools, as well as a high school, a freshman class in a high school in California, which has some of the most progressive comprehensive sex education. And as you will see, at 44 years old, sitting in that class, I got the giggles because it was shocking to me, but also really empowering to be able to see how normalized the conversation was for these kids, and it just confirmed my desire to want to normalize the conversation on a national level for the good of ourselves, but also for future generations. So without further ado, here is the first installment of This Is Sex.
I'm gonna give you a question. You wanna huddle and be like, oh, I know this. And one person can write it. Maybe the person with the neatest writing, I don't know. Does everybody have a towel and a marker? Okay, are we ready? Okay, this is a big one. What do we call the official name of when a woman receives oral sex? The official name. The receiver of oral sex. Check your notes if you're not sure. I know you have it. I want to give everybody a fair chance. Okay, we're all good? Yeah. Okay, what's the answer? Cunnilingus. Who spelled it right? Let me see. Oh, some of you guys are good. Okay, good. Okay, here we go. Next question. I'm going to give you a hard one. You guys ready? Can you handle a hard one? No? Yeah, no? We'll see. I want you to name the area of skin in a female. Males also have it, but when we talk about females, between the vaginal opening and the anus. That's a tough one. I told you. They're hot right here. Let me see. Come on. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Lift up your boards. What's the answer? Perineum. Very good. Wait, what is that?
I didn't know that last one. This is Ms. Jenkins' sex ed class at Monroe High School in Los Angeles, California, a state that just passed a sex ed law that's been called the most progressive in the country. Do you think most parents know that you talk about things like cunnilingus?
Probably not.
My favorite is coitus interruptus. I love that. Anyway.
So who are my winners? Team 3. Okay, good job, Team 3. Okay, listen, let me tell you how ridiculous your prize is, okay? I ordered these crowns all the way from England. Yeah, be proud. It's like sex ed royalty right here. Here you go, Lisa. Yeah, it's so silly. Yeah.
Did you have sex ed growing up?
Very little. I mean, definitely at home, I didn't have anything like that.
You didn't talk about sex with your family?
No, and I tell my students this all the time because I want them to understand how much I was like them or am like them. And I remember asking a few things, and my mom would just kind of shame me, like, why do you want to know that? You just start understanding at a young age, like, this is just not something we do here. And I didn't question, why can't I do this? This is just the way it is.
I know that this campus has a teen health clinic where kids can get contraception, even the morning after pill, for free.
Yes.
I also noticed a flyer in the bathroom for free condoms. How does that not plant the seed of sex in a teenager's mind?
Come on, I mean, there's so much stuff out there. Like, I don't mean to laugh, but like, really, like, that flyer planted the idea of sex in this kid. If that's the case, then this kid's been living in a bubble. You may not agree with it, and that's where your values come in, but this is what people are doing.
Sex education has always been something kind of controversial in schools. Around late 1980s, teen pregnancy rates were rising. And there was concern specifically because these young parents were often not married. And there was a belief that teenage pregnancy was inextricably tied to poverty. But also we saw, as we know, the rise of HIV, and the AIDS epidemic was raging. So you had these two forces coming together right around the 1990s, where one force was we need to get in and educate young people about sex and sexuality, and the other was this strategy that was to say, we just want young people to say no.
And there's just no stopping him.
And so there was a clashing sort of the culture wars right there on the school grounds.
Since then, our teen pregnancy rate has gone down, but there are huge racial disparities. Latinas and Black women are more than twice as likely to give birth as teens than white women. And our nation's STD rates have reached an all-time high. We spend nearly $16 billion treating STDs every year. Over the years, administrations have shifted the nation's sex ed strategies through federally funded programs.
Abstinence for young people is the only certain way to avoid sexually transmitted diseases.
But only half the states in the U.S. actually require sex ed be taught in schools at all. When sex ed is taught, more than a third require instruction centered on abstinence until marriage.
Those same states, unfortunately, are the places where we see some of the highest rates of unintended pregnancy amongst young people, some of the higher rates of STDs as well.
And in Washington, the war over what's best for America's young people continues.
Only dealing with pregnancy prevention or only dealing with STD, that's not enough, because there are emotional consequences, social consequences.
Valerie Huber has been a leading voice on abstinence-focused education, recently rebranded as sexual risk avoidance. Since our interview, she was appointed to a position in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Now some say, well, you're being awfully unrealistic by saying waiting until marriage. I've read the research. I know the majority of Americans are going to have sex before marriage. That does not mean that we should engage in the soft bigotry of low expectations. If inherent in contraceptive education, there is an underlying either implicit or explicit normalization of teen sex, then that is either an implicit or explicit encouragement to engage in risky behavior.
You can't tell me that by giving information you're hurting people or you're starting behaviors that wouldn't have started had you not given information.
On the Hill, Congresswoman Barbara Lee has been pushing for federal legislation and funding in favor of comprehensive sex ed. For her, the fight is personal.
I'd like to just remind us that we're not living in the dark ages. This is the 21st century. Abstinence programs do not work. I know what happens when you don't have comprehensive sex education. I was 16 years old the first time I learned about sex, and I got pregnant. As a pregnant teen myself, we didn't have comprehensive sex education in my school, and I wish I had. So I've been there, done that, and that was a long time ago, and we're still there.
With sexual risk avoidance education, we educate on contraception, we do not demonstrate, we do not distribute, and we do not encourage sex.
You want to do it? Sombrero. Yeah, you don't have to pinch the bottom. There's semen in there, remember? You don't want to tear that area at all. Point the penis down because it's flaccid. Remember, starting to get small, doesn't stand up like that anymore, and then you enroll it, yeah.
According to California law, what Ms. Jenkins teaches must be medically accurate and cannot promote religion. And the curriculum goes well beyond pregnancy and STDs. Lessons must be inclusive of all sexual orientations and gender identities, teach about consent, sexual harassment, and the negative impacts of gender stereotypes.
What should be the very first thing, really quickly? Talk to your partner about having sex, for sure. What was the next thing that you were? Consent, okay. We have same-sex couples, we have different types of sex, but if there is penetration, condoms can also be used for anal sex. Condoms could also be used to give someone oral sex.
And do you think this new, more inclusive law is allowing for the kind of environment that allows these kids to feel more comfortable?
Absolutely. I think they're starting to see that they're being protected. You know, when we talk about sexual harassment, it includes protecting people who are in safe-sex relationships. I've also had several situations of students who are very comfortable with telling me that they are transitioning, transgender. I do ask for their preferred pronouns, and they're very open about that.
In some states in this country, abstinence only is the mandate in schools. They can't demonstrate condoms or really show anything.
Right.
What do you think of that mandate?
Gosh, I respect how people do things, but they have to see that there's an injustice here. We later see as adults that they could have learned this, but they didn't. Then they repeat the same cycle. I'm a big advocate for teens, for young people. I want to hear their voices because they have one. How could you not ask the kids, like, what would you like to learn?
Where's the proprietor of this establishment?
Who, the what?
I see the one. Do we have permission to take these?
He's always amazing.
And you guys are about to start, right?
Yes.
Since you're...
Oh, okay. Where is he? Oh, there you go. I see him.
Start now?
Oh, Case interjection. All right. You all know me. My name is Tyler Yarborough. So a little bit about my council. We advocate for comprehensive sex education and increased sexual and reproductive health services to all young people in the state of Mississippi. We want you to have a seat at the table when legislators are passing legislation that is going to affect your lives.
Tyler's a senior in high school in Mississippi, a state where the majority of school districts are teaching abstinence only.
So, Lee Academy doesn't have this stuff.
You don't have sex education?
No.
As far as Tyler and his friends are concerned, that's just not good enough.
You do understand that, 98% of the guys at our school that have sex use Plan B as, their go-to.
And that's something that you shouldn't use as, it should not replace contraceptives like the other ones. LARCs are long-acting reversible contraception. So this is a type of birth control that gives you safe contraception that lasts a period of time.
What does it look like?
What?
The LARC.
Oh, LARC. So it's just the acronym for the IUD, the patch, the implant, the shot. And
Tyler, I know that you hold events where you are educating young people about safe sex practices.
Right.
You do very well in school, have a very promising future ahead of you. Why take on sex education? Why is that such a big issue for you?
In the state of Mississippi, most of those, when we talk about contraceptives at all, they're geared towards showing the negative side of all of them and rarely showing the positive side of them. And I feel like that with a lot of my peers, They see the problems.
Mississippi consistently ranks among the states with the highest teen pregnancy, HIV, and STD rates in the U.S. Couple that with among the highest rates of people living in poverty and without health insurance.
What do teenagers do for fun out here?
There's nothing for teens to do here. The Mississippi Delta is pretty much known for its poverty, for our poor education system. I grew up in poverty. My mom, she was a teen mom. After my dad left, she had to get a job at a convenience store in town, working $7.25 an hour, raising 4 kids. When teens become teen moms, contract STIs, that contributes to the era of poverty. Advocating for sex education could be a solution to a piece of that problem.
If you had the opportunity to directly address some of your state legislators about this abstinence-only approach, what would you say to them?
I would tell them that it's exclusive. It do not reach the majority of my peers and young people across the state.
Have you had many interactions with legislators who are just completely steadfast in their positions?
We went to lobby in Jackson, and there was one legislator who, he pretty much told us that if kids just start going to church, they wouldn't be engaged in all of these risky sexual behaviors. It's hard to just counteract that so many people are not abstaining, so many people are sexually active.
In Mississippi, 48% of high school students have had sex by the time they finish the 12th grade, the highest rate in any U.S. state. And 44% of sexually active students reported not using condoms. That's something this women's health clinic in Tyler's town of Clarksdale sees firsthand.
Our pregnant patients, we see a vast majority of teenage pregnancies.
To what do you attribute those high numbers?
Number one, education, what they've been taught in the school, and here in Mississippi, teachers are limited in what they can teach students.
There are people who don't believe that sex should be talked about in school at all, that the responsibility of talking to kids about sex should be the parents only. How do you respond to that?
The parents are afraid to talk about it. When I was growing up, my mother tried to have a conversation with me. I laughed, she turned red, and it was over.
If patients can come here and get information from their medical providers, why is it necessary in schools to teach sex education?
There's a barrier with parents. They don't feel that they can ask their parent to come here, so they need it in school because they're going to school. When you have to ask to come here, because most can't drive, then the first red flag to the parent is, what are you doing? I don't mean to offend anyone, but I have a 16-year-old and I want someone talking to her and for her to be able to ask questions if needed. I think that's huge for these kids. In the real world, abstinence is not all they need to know. They need to know what's available to them.
Abstinence only is a misnomer that has been placed on the teachings of risk avoidance.
But let me tell you something about what smoking does.
So the same public health principles that are applied to avoiding other risks that are harmful to young people's health, why not apply it to sex? Don't smoke, don't drink. Why not don't have sex until you are in a mutually monogamous, committed relationship?
Dr. Frieda McKissick Bush serves on Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant's task force to reduce teen pregnancy.
But we now know that the brain is not fully mature for making those executive decisions until you're in your mid-20s. So asking a 14-year-old or 15-year-old to be making long-term decisions considering effect is inappropriate. So there are consequences of the hookup culture that go beyond the immediate gratification. Sex is not just a physical event, it's emotional. Many of the young people end up having depression. Young people who are sexually active actually make lower grades.
Dr. McKissick Bush helped shape guidelines for the implementation of Mississippi's sex ed law. She stands by some of its most controversial restrictions, including the ban on condom demonstrations and on mixed-gender classrooms.
I think young ladies in particular are more modest. Our experience has been that when the males are present in the classroom, that they may not freely express themselves. The purpose was to allow them, both males and females, to freely express themselves, get their questions answered.
I personally believe that we need to have mixed-gendered classrooms, and right now, the state of Mississippi says that they must be single-gendered. I also feel like that it shames women and girls the most. I've actually been in school where if a girl is sexually active, it is seen as something that is so bad, but when a male does it, he's praised. So let's start with the biggest, sexual orientation. So that's something that we also want to break too, gender roles and gender stereotypes. We want to reach out to the LGBTQ community, those who are already sexually active, those who have children.
Tyler's mom, Kimberly, never got that kind of outreach. Today, she's a nurse, but her journey there wasn't easy. By age 21, she was a mother of 4.
We didn't have that when I was in school. Our parents, they didn't even want to talk to us about sex. The sex talk was, don't do it. Nothing about contraceptive, nothing about, having a baby, STIs, nothing, just don't get pregnant. If I had access to that education and the resources, I wouldn't have become a teen mom.
What do you think about the fact that you are the motivation for Tyler to try and advocate for more sex education in school?
Tyler know the struggle firsthand. He know the struggle of me being a single parent, me trying to work, trying to go to school, even living in low-income housing, getting welfare, getting food stamps. No one can tell me how that feel, because my kids know. They know that I slept on a floor, on a mattress for 3 years. I didn't care. I'm very proud of Tyler.
I love you.
Love you more.
Before anything, there is something called family planning, okay? Whatever the case might be, when you start dating and getting to know someone, you have to have those conversations. What do you see? How many kids do you want? How would we raise them? Your kids are gonna depend on you so much. If somebody grows up in a really stable environment with parents who are there, yeah, maybe sometimes we're in a hurry, the house is a mess, but that's their house. Those are their parents, and that is a big part of who we are in our self-esteem. When we talk about sex ed, what a lot of people don't understand is that it involves a lot of self-respect, and really owning your body, you're in charge. And if we had more students having the opportunity to talk about these things, there would be healthier sexual relationships.
Can you confidently say that you are helping to raise sexually responsible young adults?
All right, we'll give it up for Monroe High School Sex Squad.
I think I have a lot to do with it. I'd like to believe that. It's just about having conversations. Let's talk about it. We're reproducing, we're falling in love, that's never gonna end. Social media might change, the gadgets that we use might change, but sex is here to stay, and there's only new discoveries, and how unfortunate if we leave our kids out.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce the panel who's going to pick up the discussion, and I just want to remind you again now that we're asking you really to continue the conversation even after tonight, to talk to the person next to you before you go, and then to talk after that. I think it was right at the end, somebody said something like, if more students had the opportunity to talk about these things, there would be an opportunity for healthier relationships. Did that, and we have light. So let me turn it over to the panel, and I'll just give you a little bit more background on Lisa Ling, who we're fortunate to have here with us. You should Google her. You should Google everybody afterwards, but let me just share with you just a couple of highlights. Lisa Ling has been a correspondent for ABC News, National Geographic, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. She co-hosted the daytime talk show The View, which I was on once as a surprise guest, but a long time, not related to these issues. Lisa's reporting has taken her all around the world, and we're really very glad that you're here. Next to Lisa is my colleague and friend, Professor Jennifer Hirsch from the Mailman School of Public Health. Professor Hirsch is an expert in gender, sexuality, and reproductive health. She specializes in the theory and methods of public health research and programs, and she, along with Dr. Claude Mellons, co-directs the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, the SHIFT project that has been studying, with the support of the Office of the President at Columbia, sexual health and sexual assault among Columbia and Barnard undergraduates. Next to Professor Hirsch is Francisco Ramirez, who I'm also pleased to say is a colleague in our efforts in the Sexual Respect Initiative, and also a Mailman Public Health School graduate. Francisco has provided sexual health workshops and program development for MTV, the United Nations, and Planned Parenthood, where he served as Vice President for Education and Training. Francisco has created and consulted on initiatives, on apps. He is a star facilitator in workshops for the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship initiatives, including some that are coming up later next week, I think. So check your University Life app or the Sexual Respect website for more of those. And next to Francisco, we're really pleased to have Maddie Stuzin. She is a Columbia College junior, a student athlete, and a trained facilitator in relationship violence awareness. And Maddie, along with other members of the women's lacrosse team and her sorority, Kappa Alpha Theta, right? Has helped to bring more training to more than 1,000 Columbia students just in the last year. And as of this fall, to all athletic teams at Columbia through the One Love training that I'm sure she'll talk about. So again, welcome to our panelists. Welcome again to everybody here, and we'll turn it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Just out of curiosity, how many of you did not know that was the perineum? Made me feel good here. Yeah, thank you. Okay, a couple of you. So what we saw was how sex education is and isn't taught in high schools, but how applicable are those issues in colleges? Jennifer?
So what we saw in SHIFT is that there's a lot of variability in the preparation that students have for college life. So, and I think, everyone comes here and you're taught about consent, but you can't teach calculus if people haven't had arithmetic, and there are a lot of students who haven't had arithmetic. And so I think that they're unevenly prepared, which is hard.
And Maddie, do you have any insights on that as a student?
I mean, yeah, I agree that there hasn't been a kind of universal streamlined approach, that we're all kind of getting different pieces of the puzzle. And I do think that the formalized education is only part of it. And so as a student, yes, I need that formal education, but then I also need to feel comfortable talking about it in conversations with my friends. And so it's all about laying the groundwork in a way that the conversations can continue. So it continues outside the classroom, continues after we watch episodes like this. So yes, I agree with what you're saying, exactly.
How many of you would have probably benefited from having comprehensive sex ed in high school? Yeah, I thought that was amazing, particularly, as I said earlier, just how normalized the conversation was. But both sides are dug in deep, right? You have those who are defiant about promoting comprehensive sex ed, and you have those who are defiant about the abstinence-only mandate. Is there common ground that can be reached, Jennifer?
I mean, the common ground is that we love children, right? We want them to grow into healthy adults, and I think that for people who have been proponents of sex ed, we have dropped the ball a little bit by not being willing to take on the values issue. I think the value is that sex is a normal part of a healthy life, unlike maybe smoking. And so we want children to grow up into people who can enjoy their sex lives. And part of the message of abstinence only until marriage is that sex is a dirty, rotten, nasty thing that you should only do to someone you love after you're married. So that doesn't really prepare people to come of age. And I think that we need to be direct about saying, what do people need to grow up into people who are functional, healthy, delighting in their lives adults?
Well, yet we are constantly promoting sex and publicizing sex. Francisco, I want to ask that question to you. What should comprehensive sex education look like in this country?
Well, it should look a lot like very much what we saw there. I mean, comprehensive sex ed, what's so great about it is it does, and a lot of people don't know this, it does talk about the value of abstaining and the value of making the decision for yourself to engage in whatever sexual activity you might be interested in when you feel it's appropriate for yourself. And it goes very, very much through the potential consequences there. But it does a lot more. It talks about how do you treat people with respect? What happens during puberty? What does it mean if something in a relationship feels like it crosses the line? And I think where we've really failed ourselves, and I'm really speaking really globally on this as well, is that we just haven't made the grand efforts that I think we need to get people on the same page. No one is born out of the womb knowing everything about their bodies and how to relate to people, and it's up to us as citizens, as communities, to support each other in that.
And on that note, what would you say are the keys to teaching or talking about sex? What are some of the fundamentals?
So I was thinking about this just we were speaking at the journalism school here a couple of days ago, and I actually think that one of the keys to teaching about sex is to do a ton of listening. One of the things that I do in New York City parks is I put out a sign that says free advice, relationships, sex, and dating for the last 10 years, and people just line up with their family members and we have all kinds of conversations. And it's really a misnomer that it says it's advice. It's really people talking to me. And it's more about me being a witness to their truth than anything else. And to sort of meld it together with your earlier question of how is this possible if we're in different camps? And a lot of times it feels like we are. How do we bridge that? A lot of times if I'm just silent with somebody and they're telling me about their experiences, current or as children, around sex, relationships, whatever it is, that's sort of when we begin to crack and become vulnerable in ways that hopefully serve us.
So according to statistics, young people are delaying when they have sex. However, STDs, as we reported, are through the roof. We spend $16 billion a year treating STDs. Maddie, do you get the sense that college students are aware of resources that are available to them, or how to go about getting those resources?
No, it's a good question, because especially here, I'm so aware of all the resources that I have, but yet I know in conversations there are people who wouldn't think to kind of utilize those resources because there is a stigma about talking about it with your friends and saying, okay, I'm going to go here, get this education, I'm going to kind of ask about sex, I'm going to ask about STDs and all of this stuff. And so, yes, even though a university might kind of supply the goods, as it were, you have to kind of create an environment where the students are going to be able to feel comfortable kind of talking about it and actually going to seek that help. Because I think there's a difference between awareness and having kind of the comfort to be able to kind of go after those services.
And what would you suggest for students to be able to ask for those services and feel comfortable about it? Jennifer and Francisco?
I mean, I think that undoing the sexual shame that people live in, it has to be a multi-pronged effort. So there's the family. What are the messages that parents give their children? Can they say vagina and penis, or do they say whatever made-up words other people say? I think that it's not just that kids get information in school. I think it plays an important role sort of culturally legitimizing the idea that decent people are interested in sex. And then there's sort of the work that you're doing, which I think of as cultural activism. So I think that layering together, we can collectively move away from a culture of shame. There are other countries in the world where there's less shame around sex.
And Francisco, how would you recommend that students are able to feel confident enough to seek out those resources?
Yeah, well, I think first, maybe two things. One is just take a moment tonight when you're in the shower, when you're on the A train, the 1 train, whatever it is, just kind of think of how are you sort of oriented around sex? Where are you? Just take sort of your own temperature, if you will, because a lot of times conversations about sexuality, we can put up our walls so quickly. So just kind of check in with yourself now, tonight, after this conversation, and then kind of track it over time. The other thing to add on to what you're saying is really around the stigma, not even just the stigma of sex, but specifically, I am big at tackling the stigma around STIs or sexually transmitted infections. I always like to tell people that the majority of sexually active adults in this country have an STI. Ta-da, here we are.
One in 5 Americans has herpes.
Yeah, and that's not even going into HPV, right? So
there are how many people in this room?
Yeah, exactly.
But
don't ask them to raise their
hand.
Yeah.
Right, and so so much of my frustration working in sex ed is the way that STIs are presented in sort of, this kind of demonized quality. And if we say, and this is a controversial thing to say, and I'm not depending on the platform, so this is me speaking as myself, if I really believe, and I do, that being a sexually active adult can sometimes lead to STIs, and STIs are not necessarily a marker of a bad person. It's a marker of someone who's sexually active, period. If we can get to that place and sort of start to undo some of this history, I think we'll be better off.
Jennifer, can you talk about the Sexual Health Initiative to foster transformation?
Sure, a little bit. I mean, so SHIFT was a research project, as Suzanne said, that was funded by the Office of the President, examining sexual assault and sexual health among Columbia and Barnard undergraduates. And without sharing all of our findings, because this is sort of not the moment for that, I think that we did, I would circle back to what I said earlier about the unevenness of sexual preparation. So some people start, when kids come to college, this, they're kind of already cooked as human beings, right? And so some kids arrive here at orientation, they've had sex, they've had good sex ed, they have what we talk about as a clear sense of their own sexual citizenship, a sort of sense of the right to sexual self-determination, which prepares them well then for having whatever kind of sex they want to have. And other kids really have grown up in a lot of sexual shame. If you can't think to yourself, what kind of sex do I want to be having? That doesn't set you up very well to have a conversation about consent. So I guess I would say the take home is that this is the problem of sexual assault is a problem that we experience at Columbia, but it's not entirely of our own making. I think that we have to hold the communities and schools accountable. Who produces people who are so awkward about sex that they have to get super drunk to have it?
Yeah, I mean, and so you believe that if we normalize the conversation, if we're able to seek out resources, if we're able to just talk about these things, we could actually make a dent in reducing sexual assault on college campuses?
I think so. I mean, I sent my son off to college with a gross of condoms. I'm like, you're going to be having sex, be safe. I think not just as a health thing, but as a message like, you're an adult. I know this is happening. I want you to have love and pleasure in your life. Not everyone is going to get that from their parents, and so I think that and so I think that thinking about what are the other ways in which we can make sure that students are prepared when they get here.
Let's talk about social media. How do you think social media does it help or hurt young people's awareness about sex? Do you think people can use it and actually become more educated about it, or is it having the opposite effect, in this hookup culture that we live in?
Yeah, that's a big, exciting question. I really think, generally, I think it's easy to sort of hate on the social media, you know, for all sorts of reasons, but really, generally speaking, I think a lot of people are doing great things with it. I think as a field of sex ed, I think we're personally quite behind on it, but the exciting thing that I see is it sort of where we may be slower in the field of sex ed to sort of respond and put things out there, people are doing it on their own. And that's really exciting, and I think probably more meaningful. That said, probably my biggest concern about it, if any really, is just the folks who aren't included in it. And I think about not only the digital divide, but the secondary, digital divide. Who has the DSLR to, create some neat content, or the smartphone, or the electricity, depending on the place, right? To be able to create media, to consume it, to have that media literacy for it. I recognize sort of, the intersections of oppression, and I want to make sure that we are doing as good of a job as we can to support everyone, if they're homeless, or if they don't speak English, or, if they're in some part of the world or the country where resources are harder to come by.
At what age, just in this digital age, this social media age, what age should we start talking to young people about sex? I mean, I know I have a 4-year-old and I'm ready because I do not want her to repeat any of the mistakes I made, because I had so little knowledge about sex. I think I left myself open to some really risky behavior. But would you say there is an appropriate age?
Yeah, when they learn to talk. I mean, they learn their body parts. So this is your elbow, this is your vagina. Like, I think that's the beginning of normalizing sex, is just acknowledging like all of the names of the body parts, and then making room for their questions.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. My one addition would be, kind of to respect. For me, it's a fine line between that, that I would want to educate a young person from a very young age, from around when they're able to talk, or maybe even before that. Maybe their first word will be, perineum, for all we know. I don't know.
And then I wish that instead of having, for instance, the school nurse teaching us in front of the room to a bunch of little girls. I went to an all-girls school, and it was progressive, but not in terms of the sex education that we were given. But I would have liked to be more encouraged to talk to my peers about sex rather than just being given information. And yes, when we're learning to talk, what kind of conversations can we have with our 6-year-old friends about sex? But as I got older, 5th, 6th grade, I would have liked to have been able to be encouraged to talk about those things with my friends.
And do you get the sense that those forums exist here at Columbia or any other colleges? Do you think that there are those outlets for young people to be able to have these open discussions?
Well, basically what I have done with the One Love Foundation is that. So for a little background, the One Love Foundation was created by the family of Yardley Love, who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 2010. And her family basically admit that if they had this education on relationship violence, then she would still be alive today. And so that's kind of our backbone. And they created this workshop called the Escalation Workshop, which is a video and then discussion, basically a workshop where you watch this video and then a group of peers with a facilitator who facilitates rather than leads the conversation, discuss topics like consent, relationship violence, healthy and unhealthy relationships. But kind of the important takeaway in our method is that it's a conversation that's very much directed by the students. And so there's this kind of organic discussion about these topics in a way where you don't feel like it's mediated through someone superior to you. And I think that was the big issue for me with some of the workshops that I had in high school, some of the ones I had as a freshman at Columbia. But the cool thing about our workshop is that I feel like I'm talking to my peers about sex in a way that feels unmediated.
I don't want to get political here, but unfortunately, sex is very politicized in this country. How do you think this administration is going to have an impact on the existing sex education or opportunities to have open discussions on college campuses and high schools as well?
I mean, now we love states' rights, right? And so it's not impossible that states that, I mean, the first legislative advocacy campaign that I worked on in New York in 2004 was comprehensive sex ed, and it didn't get passed with Eliot Spitzer. So maybe now is a moment when states will see that nothing is going to move at the federal level, or it's only going to get worse. And so maybe some states will follow California's lead, but most won't, right? Mississippi, Alabama, that's not going to go ahead. And so you're just going to see sort of an exacerbation of the existing disparities. I'm sorry to be sort of despairing about that.
Yeah, and sadly, we'll probably see that STD number continue to grow as well as a result.
Yeah, I mean, it's when we track it sort of over time, anytime that we see money going down in terms of supporting programs that we have clear, overwhelming evidence that improves health outcomes, when that money goes down, then negative health outcomes increase. So there's really kind of no telling, where we will be. But when I know how frustrating it can be, and I feel like a lot of my work ends up being not even just with this administration, but a lot of times in the politicization of it, it feels like I'm less in the field of sex education and more in the field of sex education justification, right? And I long for a day when we can talk about pleasure and making great choices as opposed to fighting to be able to talk in a high school in Queens with 8th graders about their body parts when it's legal in New York. And so the last comment I would say on that is, if folks feel down, to the extent that people might feel down about, oh my gosh, where are we headed? I really think that the grassroots, that the individual conversations that people are having with each other are where I think a lot of the cultural shift changes, and that, this is my belief, then leads to political shifts ultimately.
Well, I want to open this up for questions if anyone in the room has any.
One thing I am worried about is when a lot of terms used in sexual relationship education get hackneyed. Like my one concern is especially folks of my male ilk are like, yeah, no means no, consent, whatever. That's my main concern. Like when certain terms are so overused that despite how important they are, they lose their potency. So my question is how can sexual and relationship education programs keep this subject relevant throughout all ages? Thank you.
Go ahead, please. No, please.
I mean, in terms of evolution, we see social media as kind of one of the main components now that wasn't there before. And kind of speaking about what the One Love Foundation does is we actually just launched this new campaign called Behind the Post, which is an analysis of how the photos that people are putting out on Facebook and social media and Twitter only tell part of the story. So for instance, you could Instagram a picture of you and your partner looking completely happy, but yet you could have had a screaming match right before that. So it's all about being skeptical when it comes to social media, and knowing that people, because of the stigma of, I can't speak out if my relationship is bad, because there's supposed to be this perception that everything is going great. So this idea of kind of being skeptical and taking information and then asking, and the same thing with the language is, okay, well, what does consent really mean? What is a healthy relationship? And not just taking in those words and absorbing them because someone in the front of the room is telling you, but being able to discuss what they mean with your peers. And I think just being skeptical of kind of those hackneyed phrases, as you said.
And if I could add to that, I would just say, I think it's a fantastic question. I agree exactly with what you're saying. I think the more that we, as educators or concerned folks, challenge or allow each other to tell each other in your own words, how do you want to say yes means yes or no means no or something about consent? I get sick of hearing these phrases myself sometimes too. So tell me, put it on, tweet it at me, whatever it is. Let's come up with new ways of having these conversations. And when they're coming from peers, when they're coming from sort of your own minds, they're going to be so much more potent and valuable.
Hi, so my question is actually about the porn industry, which is something that many people engage, that obviously many people engage in this culture where sex is stigmatized. A lot of people instead turn to porn as the way to address their needs. And I know porn is also reaffirming so many unhealthy relationships and a very particular type of sexual script that goes on in the bedroom, which adds to many other things. But I know that there is a sector of the porn industry that is working on healthier exposing of, talking about consent, talking about affirmation, having conversations beforehand and what it actually looks like versus this weird fantasized situation that they've been showing. So I'm curious if that has made it into the education or if that's talked about in this series at all.
We don't really talk about porn in our series, but what I will say as someone who has covered many stories in the professional porn industry, I mean, now porn it's so widespread, people are doing it, in their own homes, but as far as the professional porn industry is concerned, it's actually quite progressive, and performers have to get tested with regularity. And so the incidences of STDs in the porn industry are far lower than the general population, which is really interesting. And people who work in that industry, they know exactly what to look for, and they are extremely educated about what to look for. So, I mean, I think as far as that is concerned, we could actually take a page from the porn industry.
I definitely appreciate that the porn industry is aware of sexually transmitted infections, but the script that they're playing out, and that is really becoming, or has been, the sex education for these adolescents in, how to consent to sex and how to treat one another during sex, is that being addressed in the education, if you're aware of it?
Gabriel, do you want to, what is the impact that is having on young people today?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
You're probably good to...
Oh, no, please, no, I wasn't sure. No, go ahead.
Oh, can you repeat the question?
What kind of impact do you think the porn industry is having on young people today? Would you say that's a...
Yeah.
And what is being done to address it?
Yeah, essentially just the schemas that it's creating about what sex is and what it means for women to have sex, kind of especially, and their role in sex and their consent during sex.
Even beyond the porn industry, so I want to sort of frame the heterosexual script of male aggression and women going along with it or not that you see in some heterosexual pornography in relation to the broader cultural script about heterosexual relations where, who does the promposal? It's always the guy. And so I think that having a broader conversation about gender and relationship agency and who does the asking, you can't get to a conversation about consent until you have that broader conversation about the sexual script. I think it's really, really important, but not just in relation to porn, sort of more broadly about social relations.
I come from a very conservative community, which focuses abstinence-based, like I said, so I've had to educate myself a lot, and I've had these conversations with my friends, but I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions on how to open this conversation up to a community that's very resistant to having it.
There are some religious communities, like the Unitarian Church has an awesome sex ed curriculum. That's actually the one that we used as the basis for developing the elementary school curriculum at the Columbia School. So there are some, I taught sex ed in my temple, there are some religious communities that see that values transmission message as their mandate. Obviously, that's not the case everywhere. So what do people do?
I mean, I can only speak from my experience, and that the times that I have been able to sort of go into places that I didn't think I would be able to was by kind of hanging out, and not in a subversive way or in a sort of sneaky way, but I used to work in migrant camps in California, and we wanted to really do some good education around sexual and reproductive health, and we had everything ready. We had raffles and prizes and food and the whole thing, and people were like, "You're talking about what?" No, and so ultimately, we hung around long enough that they invited us to carne asadas, like barbecue kind of things, and I started going there. And I remember one time I was like, you know what goes really well with carne asada? Some reproductive rights. Let's have a conversation. And that's an anecdote. I think what you're saying is probably more valuable. But for a lot of us, this idea of how can we start to connect sort of in safer ways around personal issues. That's what I found. I could say more, but I won't.
And the statistics bear out the consequences of not having any kind of comprehensive sex ed. I mean, as I said earlier, yes, young people are waiting, but when they do start having sex, they are completely unaware of how to attain resources or what to do if they contract something, or how to even talk about consent and condom use and birth control and those kinds of issues. So having a conversation that employs numbers could be an effective way to at least ignite a conversation at all.
I actually have another solution for you. I think that if we had universal access to primary care in America, then teenagers could go to the doctor and have a conversation with the doctor or a nurse practitioner and just totally do an end run around whatever is the community norm about not talking about sex. So I think that sex ed in the school, we may all die on that battlefield if that's the only battle we fight. And so I think we need to think a little bit more creatively about what are the different ways people need access to information. They also need access to health services.
But I applaud you for wanting to know how to attack it in your community, and I hope you continue to do so.
So I actually got interested in sexual health and sexuality after I went to a walk-in clinic to get STI testing, and the nurse practitioner I saw slut-shamed me. She actually verbatim said, "You're so pretty and there's so many scary things out there. You should really be more careful because I'm very concerned about you." So yeah, that was one thing. So what is being done to teach physicians and healthcare providers how to be very inclusive and very open about sexuality? And also, second part kind of. So I agree that sex ed in schools is very important, but also we need to teach adults and elderly things like this too. So kind of going back to the physician, if an adult is not getting this kind of education from their physician, what is being done to get this education out to kids who don't go to school every day?
Honestly, I haven't thought a lot about the challenge of re-educating American adults. I know that, so I think that that's an interesting question.
I was really impressed with the Women's Center that we visited in Clarksville, Mississippi, because it obviously is a culture that mandates abstinence only, but they at that Women's Center, I mean, they are so forthcoming about information, and they were such a welcoming environment, and they recognize that this is an epidemic. Unwanted or teen pregnancies and STIs in their community, and the majority of the people they are seeing are teenagers. Of the estimated 20 million new infections that are reported in this country, half of those are young people under the age of 25.
And part of your question is, in the past year at Planned Parenthood here in New York City, we started a program called Sex Ed for Adults, where we do specifically that, and we're going into homeless shelters and speaking with incarcerated folks about some kind of basic sex ed, and the response is overwhelming. We are booked full, wait lists to get into this programming, and an interesting sidebar on it, we had to really fight to be able to see people beyond reproductive age, which we thought was really important at Planned Parenthood, to be able to address, recognize that all people of all ages have some relationship with their sexuality, or at least deserve information to this, and sometimes the funding is more pinned towards a lot of these statistics that we're putting out there, which often focus on the higher prevalence sometimes around younger populations. So sometimes it's hard for the dollars to follow them. But I would say in the country, I don't see a ton of work in this space.
It's a great question and an important one. I mean, do you know where some of the fastest rates of STDs and STIs are taking place in senior homes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding because in so many cases, these residents, they had been in long-term relationships with their spouses for very long periods of time. Their spouse passes away. They're now in this new environment. They're having a good time and really uneducated about the consequences of risky behavior. And when they go to their physician's office, many physicians don't even ask them or they don't even consider the possibility that they could have an STI.
And I think it comes back to that idea of sexual citizenship. Who do we see as having a right to have a pleasurable, self-determining sex life? Obviously, people don't think that teenagers should, and people are imagining that old people, even though it's free and you don't need special shoes, people are imagining that old people don't have sex.
And this might be simplistic, but I mean, even in my generation, I'm a junior in college, I think there is obviously more comfort in kids my age and talking about sex, and it's been very interesting to see the ways in which I know that my peers and my friends are talking to their parents, because I think that a lot of times they're actually able to do more of the educating. And so yes, this is a very grassroots effort, but I mean, talking to people who are older than you and knowing that that's okay to talk about, and it shouldn't be uncomfortable, it should be just part of quotidian life. So
I mean, I think a good start would be to try and have a conversation with our own parents. I mean, I don't know if anyone here has actually had a productive conversation about sex with our own parents. And the reality is that in many cases, many of our parents probably don't really know that much either, because they've grown up in these kind of sheltered environments. So I think that could be kind of an interesting exercise that I think I definitely want to do, because despite all of these pieces that I've been working on, and I've worked on a number of sex-related episodes and shows, I've never really even talked to my own parents about it. So as we're talking about this, I appreciate you asking that question, because I think it could be a really interesting activity for all of us to do. Next question.
Yeah, Lisa, I am actually a big fan.
Oh, thanks.
So I guess I'm just wondering, thinking about students who have experienced different types of sexual assault or sexual abuse, are these things being discussed in the sexual education classes? Do you feel like that's something that should be left up to the social workers? And if so, if we are speaking about them in the sexual education classes, how are we being careful, not, I guess, even just speaking about consent may be triggering for these students. So I'm just wondering how we're going about that.
It's really, really important to start in middle school. I mean, even in middle school, there are people who've experienced child sexual abuse, but certainly by the time students arrive on campus, and I'm not speaking specifically about Columbia, but just in general, we know that people experience sexual assault in high school. And so beginning the conversation, yes, in kindergarten, but beginning a much more explicit conversation about choosing consensual sex, how that, and really making sure that not just talking at kids, but making sure that they get the skills to enact whatever their desires are consensually with another person. That has to happen before high school.
And the answer to your question about what they're doing in California, they do talk a lot. They spend a lot of time on sexual assault and consent. It's something they take very, very seriously.
And so my question is, one of the, I think, pink elephants in the room was that does talking about sex lead to, obviously, conversations about sexuality, gender, how we're associating ourselves. And right now, this is a huge politicized issue, especially with the recent transgender ban that came out. So I'm curious to ask, how do you guys think this is affecting the fears? I mean, are we just kind of regressing back into some sort of, I mean, I hate this word, but like homophobic agenda? And so how can we expect this to sort of, go through this administration? What do you guys think in terms of, is education going to change, or is it just going to regress back?
I'm an optimist. That's how I live. And in addition to being an optimist, I really see that, or believe that when we sort of examine certain oppressions and phobias and hatred and violence against some of the groups that you described, my belief, and from what I see from even data globally, is that broadly speaking, we are making some steps forward and then sometimes huge steps back. But at the same time that we're making huge steps back, we can't deny that we've had a recent or modern history and folks in this room who know the words that you're talking about, right? This is not new information for a lot of us, whereas 15 years ago, we would have been asking, what are you talking about, a lot of us? So I think collectively we are moving forward, but it's, undeniable that we are facing a number of setbacks, and that people are really scared. People are really scared about what's going to happen in terms of immigration alone. The intersections between immigration and reproductive rights alone, or access to health care alone, just broadly. It's astounding, and it's really terrible to see.
As you were saying, we have to think about the unusual moments of solidarity that have emerged over the past year. When Muslims and Jews went to the airport together to Terminal 4 to protest the Muslim ban. So I think that we're seeing the possibility I'm going to declare myself politically, as part of the resistance, in a very hard moment. We're seeing the possibility of new forms of solidarity, new conversations about intersectionality, and so maybe that will lead to somehow the inclusion of sexual liberation in a conversation about immigration reform. Like, we're all in this together, and I think that, as we every day march nearer to the brink of disaster, maybe that will help us build solidarity in new ways.
So a lot of cultures now really teach young women that you're pure until you have sex. Lisa, my question from Hirsch towards you, what would you say to young women who have sort of internalized this message where they've placed their self-worth, their self-worth into their sexual experiences or lack of?
Well, I think a lot of this is driven by culture, but also by religion, and I think it's terrifying and scary when you've grown up almost threatened, and I think that to the extent that you can normalize the conversation, have those conversations with your peers, and be proactive about learning about safety, I think that's really the only thing that I can suggest, because it is, I literally had the fear of God struck into me. And so, as I said earlier, I definitely engaged in some really risky behavior because I was just completely unaware. And I left myself open to any number of, STDs or pregnancies. And when I think back on it now, I become very resentful, because we're talking about our bodies. We're talking about the most natural thing. And if you choose to wait until to your marriage, that's great. But at least you should be aware of how your body functions. And I just think that we're doing such a disservice to our young people by not just teaching them about how our bodies work and how to be able to identify parts of the male and female anatomy. Thank you for sharing. So it's time to wrap this up. I want to thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. I want to encourage you all to continue this conversation. As Suzanne said, if you want to continue talking about this tonight, please do so. I just want to plug one more thing. This Sunday night, the first episode of my show airs on CNN, and it's about sexual healing. See, now I'm so liberated that I want to talk about it all the time. The whole series is not about sex, but it so happens that the first episode is about sex, and it's also about trying to dispel some of the stigma and taboos around sex, and we profile two women who consider themselves to be sexual healers. and they work with people who've experienced sexual trauma or are not intimate with their partner or have serious body image issues, which probably applies to a lot of us. And what one of the women said to me, which has just stuck in my head, and I think it really rings so true, is that if you have any deficiencies in your sex life or your sexual energy, again, because our sex is how we came to be, it affects every aspect of your life. And until she really said that, I didn't really realize how profound that statement was. And so this is not just about your sexual health. This is about your mental health and your overall well-being. So I hope you'll check out that episode on Sunday, and I hope you will continue the conversation. And Suzanne's coming back up to say a few words.
Before I thank and invite everybody to join me in thanking all of you for just a fantastic conversation, really want to pick up on something, Maddie, that you said at some point in the discussion, which is that the university has a lot of resources, and hopefully you know about them, and you can always find them on the Sexual Respect website and on the University Life app. The key, though, is connecting, right? To be able to have the conversations, to be able to get over whatever are the challenges in reaching out to the resources, whether they are about healing and resilience or more education about healthy relationships, whether they are about understanding about relationship violence and sexual assault, or about learning how to become a facilitator or running your own independent project with peers as part of the Sexual Respect Initiative. There's no limit to how many times you can participate. What a central point of the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative here really is to create the space to invite you into those conversations, whether it's to just tell a friend about what the conversation that you had today or this evening and take it further from there, or to just use it as a jumping off point for something else. So I really do want to very much reiterate and reinforce the idea of continuing the conversation with each other tonight and beyond. And now please join me in thanking everybody for just a fantastic discussion.